Hello, class. Welcome to lesson number 7, Depression and Dictatorship. The outline for today, we're going to talk about, first, we're going to start to talk about totalitarianism and try to define what it is. It's a useful concept to understand what's going on in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s and beyond. And it's also somewhat of a useful concept for today. Number 2, we're going to talk about the Great Depression, the economic reasons for what occurs between World War One and World War Two, and sets the stage for World War Two. Then we're going to talk about Stalinist Russia briefly. We'll, in a more in-depth sense, talk about the rise of fascism in Italy, and the rise of National Socialism in Germany. Then we'll briefly talk about eugenics and race and their role in Nazi ideology and their role in um, other ideologies of the period. And then we'll look at the Nazi consolidation of power um, leading up to the attempted takeover of Europe um, in the early 1940s. So, what is totalitarianism? It's good to define our terms. Um, Totalitarianism is related to authoritarianism, but totalitarianism the is a more advanced version of it. In that totalitarianism is well, let's look at some of its characteristics. First, one characteristic is that you have rule by a single party. So one thing that differentiates totalitarianism from, say, absolute monarchies, meaning kings that conferred all of the power upon themselves, which you might remember from earlier courses you may have taken regarding the kings, for instance, of France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, who was sort of an absolute ruler. He got his power from God. Everything he said was law. Totalitarianism refers to these systems arising under non-monarchical situations, specifically when you have mass culture and large political parties and large groupings of people um, ruled by a single party is means that there was a zone where there were competing parties, and then one party takes over and initiates totalizing control. So that is one of the definitions of totalitarianism. Also, you have total control of the military by that party. So it's a one-party state, and the military is totally under the control of that party. The military is not a separate, autonomous um, part of the state. You also have total control over means of communication. So um, any sort of media outlets, also forms of communication such as, back in the 1920s and 1930s, telephones, telegraph, etc. All of those are controlled by the state, which is ruled by a single party. So that means nothing goes on the airwaves without the consent of the party, and anything that goes on the airwaves that contradicts the message of the party, um, whoever managed to get that on the airwaves will be punished. So um, domestically, first you have a military which is under the rule of a single party, but domestically you have almost an internal military, a sort of a police state, where you have a inward domestic military force which uses terror to keep the populace from rebelling. You also have total control of the economy by the state. So there's really no free market. This is one of the reasons when we talk about something, say, like National Socialism, where you have the word socialism in there. Um, the idea under totalitarianism is that there is the entire economy is basically planned. It's manipulated, so it's not really a free market. So the state can decide and put all of its put all of its power towards deciding how the economy operates. And you can only have social mobility can only come through the state and the party apparatus. So um, it's not as if you have entrepreneurship for the most part. Um, it's not in any way a free market. It doesn't really interact with other economies. It's a closed economy. So it's so you can't really trust this kind of statistics that come out of it because you don't really know what's happening because there's no outside agency or outside force um, understanding the economic indicators. What is the allure of totalitarianism? Why are people attracted to it? Why does it arise? Um, in one sense, you can say um, that it seems distasteful because it reduces human freedom. It reduces the power of individuals to work their way up. It eliminates the free market. It eliminates free speech. All of these things that humans generally want. So how can you say that's attractive? Well, it's not necessarily instituted from without. Um, Nazism and fascism and Stalinism and communism, Stalinism in the 1920s and 1930s were very popular among the people. And I don't mean very popular, but I mean they were in many ways. Each of those in each of those situations, the uh, the leaders who came to power, Hitler, Mussolini, not so much Stalin, um, came in via um, actually a somewhat of a democratic system. First of all, why people flock to totalitarianism, or the reason why most psychologists and sociologists believe that they do, is that totalitarianism promises order amidst chaos. It usually arises during times of privation, economic um, economic downturns, social disorder, perceived social disorder. So it promises order amidst chaos. It also provides simple answers um, to the questions of why things are so bad or why um, really simple answers to any question. The state and the totalitarian state aims to answer that. One of the simplest answers that a totalitarian society or totalitarian government um, offers is that the problems are not the fault of the people that the state represents. The problems are the fault of an other. They're the fault of an outside group of people. And that outside group can be defined in various ways. Often in the 1920s and 1930s, it gets defined along racial or ethnic lines. Um, Jews in are the most obvious example in relation to Hitler's Germany. They are blamed for all the ills of Germany in the 1920s. They are blamed for the loss of World War One. But it's not just the other isn't always just an ethnic or a racial group, as it was the most obvious case. Sometimes it's amorphous. Um, Things like international finance or bankers or just some other group that is not a part of the body politic of which this single party state purports to represent. So it's always someone else's fault. This One of the things that under totalitarianism is that if you channel enough hate towards the other, you eventually put them into prisons or camps, and you actually create a slave labor force, which can actually buoy the economy, which is one of the dark dark parts of a totalitarian state. Totalitarianism also distributes power to early adopters. It's somewhat of a pyramid scheme, so that the earlier you get in, the more you stand to benefit. Another aspect of totalitarianism is that, and this is certainly the case in the 1920s and 1930s version of it in Europe, is that it stokes nationalist sentiments and delusions. In that, in the way that totalitarianism occurred in Germany and the Soviet Union, the pride, the national pride that is used, that what the nation is, or what the nation is defined as, is seen as almost not only holy, but to a certain extent always right and correct. And those who are outside of that national context, those who are in other countries, or those who are not considered part of the racial nation, and that is one thing, um, um, are are to be vilified. But also, the nation is, and the state is, not only all powerful, it is in many ways perfect, or considered to be perfect. And talking against it is considered to be not only regressive, and it's also considered to be dangerous. It can get you killed. Well, okay, so those are some of the things about totalitarian states, and we'll talk more about that when we get into the specifics. But when we talk about the reasons behind the collapse of the global economic system in the 1920s and 1930s, we must come to understand what happens after World War One. After World War One, Germany is forced to pay um, very large reparations to the Allies for the war. We talked about this earlier in relation to um, this greatly damages the German economy. And one of the things that happens is, during the 1920s, Germany, in order to really save Germany from financial ruin, the U.S. actually steps in and starts to give loans to Germany. But if you look at this chart under this Dawes plan, which is a plan hatched in the United States, the U.S. will give loans to Germany, so that Germany can then pay back its loans to the Allies, meaning to specifically Britain and France. But then look, then the Allies have to pay all of this money back to the United States. This circle, if you can look at the circle, you see 2.5 billion, 2 billion, 2.6 billion. What's occurring is essentially the U.S. is propping up the entire system here, and they're also U.S. is also making a great deal of money in the process. Remember, they're making money on interest payments, they're making money on all of these loans, and so the U.S. becomes very powerful and wealthy in the 1920s. But unfortunately, the global economic system, or specifically the European economic system here, is very weak and frail. It's totally dependent on this infusion of loans, that sort of goes around this circle, um, and this causes a great deal of instability in the world economy. Well, what happens when the U.S. economy crashes, as it does in October of 1929? In October 1929, on a day that's often called Black Tuesday, the U.S. stock market crashes, and you can see that from the chart to your left. In the United States, this not only wipes out a great deal of the savings of the American people, it also, when we talk about the Great Depression, it's also depressing. I mean, a lot of people, the optimism of the 1920s almost vanishes in the course of about 24 months between 1929 and say 1931, 1932. Um, this depression is one of the reasons why, I don't have it here, but if you look at an electoral map of 1928 for the United States, you see Herbert Hoover winning in a landslide with over 400 electoral votes. And then you go to 1932, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins in a landslide, and they're both of different parties. Um, really, the economy has crashed so much that people are flocking to the Democratic Party. In any case, that's U.S. history. Um, in the United States, one of the underlying problems in the United States was there in the 1920s. You had the amassing of wealth by just a few individuals, so you had a very unequal distribution of wealth. Um, and the 1920s U.S. economy was largely based on consumer products. So it's based on things like automobiles and radios and et cetera. So people buying those. Well, at a certain point, around 1927, actually, many people had bought most of the stuff that they needed. And so now there's people are not consuming as much. So that initial juice to the economy from consumption um, actually kind of starts to disappear in 1927. And then in 1929, people realized that they were just over leveraged. People had borrowed too much money, and the, the the stock market crashes in 1929. As a result of this, you have a massive decline in world trade, right? Because people don't have enough money to afford anything anymore. So world trade breaks down. What happens then is each country, and this goes for the United States as well as Britain and France and Germany, et cetera, they start to close their economies off. They're trying to protect their domestic producers. They're trying to protect those individuals and factories and industries that are creating goods inside their country because they want to keep that money within the country now, right? So they start to initiate, and the United States is very guilty of worsening actually the Great Depression by initiating a series of tariffs. Initiate a series of tariffs to close off the U.S. economy from sort of cheap goods coming in from overseas. As other economies collapse, a lot of cheap goods come on the market. A lot of those cheap goods are sent to the United States, and they undersell U.S. manufacturers. Well, the U.S. closes off and basically initiates tariffs on those goods coming in to make them at par with U.S. goods. But this is replicating itself in Germany and Britain and France, et cetera. I mean, these tariff regimes are sort of destroying the free market. They're destroying this global market. So now a country favors, also in its sort of this hyper nationalism, buy, you hear like buy American or buy German. They hyper nationalism stokes sort of this closed economy and stokes the concentration on that economy. And so the global economy essentially kind of breaks down. By 1931, most European economies are in free fall, and a lot of this is caused um, by just all they're kind of collapsing. By 1920, in the United States, let's just look at the example in the United States. By 1920, between 1929 and 1933, the U.S. gross national product is halved. Private investment collapses by 88%. Unemployment rises to 25%. This is a massive economic downturn. We can look at a chart like this about indices of industrial production. Notice 1925, things are at a certain rate. Then look at 1929. I mean, if you go along the section here, you can see that these countries are doing comparatively well, doing well 1927, 1929, and then the cliff. Then 1930. Look at that downturn, 1929 to 1930 in the United States. France is still doing pretty well, as is Britain. This is one of the reasons why we think that France and Britain did not turn to totalitarianism. The United States, look at how deep this downturn turns in Germany by almost half between 1929 and December 1931. Even further by the next year. Just absolute free fall. And look at the United States as well. Huge downturn. Not as bad in France and Britain, but bad nonetheless. Here's another chart that shows defense expenditures of the great powers over this period of time. So now we're looking at, you can see Japan. Look at how Japan just absolutely takes off after 1936, after they invade Manchuria. Look at Italy. Just, I mean, this is millions of $1989. So Italy is spending an enormous amount. The USSR, Germany, the U.S. Look how long it takes the U.S. to get up to this point. Okay, the U.S. is sort of staying out of it, although they too are increasing it. So each, just as what happened in World War One, these different nations arming themselves and stockpiling munitions. This is happening all over again as each of these countries walls themselves off and grows increasingly distrustful of the other nations. This map shows interesting about how the different dictatorships between 1932 and 1937, which arise. Um, Everything in yellow, by the way, these were dictatorships before 1932. So all of this in yellow was already dictatorships. These between in this 5-year period show you how many turn to not only turn to authoritarianism. Um, Totalitarianism is a little more extreme form, but these are all authoritarian states. Um, Spain, for instance, won't be totalitarian; it will be authoritarian. USSR and Germany will be totalitarian, but the distinction is still argued about. So, but these are all dictatorships in any look what remains um, under parliamentary rule. France and Great Britain, the Allied side in World War II. You see Czechoslovakia. We'll talk about Czechoslovakia and the threat that Hitler believed that Czechoslovakia posed to Germany. So essentially, you have a storm brewing because World War I has really settled nothing. It really has not taught anything. There's the League of Nations, which was supposed to, or at least it had been conceived as a way of sort of preventing these conflicts. Never really comes to fruition. The U.S. never joins. It's terribly weak and can do nothing in the face of rearmament and this rush to hypernationalism. Most of the emerging powers, and by emerging powers I mean those relatively new nations, and they're not new nations. I mean, Germany is relatively new. Germany is a nation state which is really born out of the sort of 1870s, as is Italy, born really in the 1860s. Japan comes out of the Meiji Restoration in 1868 and really opens itself up to the world and quickly becomes the dominant military power in the Asia Pacific region. Most of these new powers reject liberalism and reject liberal democracy. And they turn towards a form of authoritarian militaristic rule. In Germany, you have the Nazis. Italy, you have the fascists. In Japan, you have the nationalists. USSR, you have the communists and Stalinists, Leninists. The global depression stokes nationalism, as I described just a second ago. Militarism becomes a distraction from these economic woes. So governments start to pour money into arming the state. This helps the populace sort of concentrate on things in a militaristic context. The power of the state becomes something that the populace focuses on. Also, juicing the economy by pouring money into military expenditures has that effect. I mean, of juicing the economy. It has an effect of artificially. It puts a lot of people to work. It puts a lot of people to work making things that nobody knows that will ever be used, but of course they are used. So it's really a form. It's kind of a form of socialism in that when you start to pour money into all of these military expenditures and just constantly pump all of this money into that, you are creating, you're creating jobs for people, but it's somewhat of an artificial process. And this is one way to buoy the economy in the absence of being connected to the rest of the world economy. The centralized economy, this minimizes the urban effects of poverty. So people are at work, but this is a closed system, a closed loop. Let's first look at Stalinism. Let's go over to the Soviet Union and look at how this arises under Stalin. When the Bolsheviks first take over Russia in 1917, they call for international communism. They call for basically a global revolution, a global communist revolution. This never occurs, and there are some small revolutions, but this never really takes hold. And one thing, by the time you get to Stalin, who takes over from Lenin after Lenin's death, is that Stalin has as one of his slogans, socialism in one country. So after that international communist uh, dream never reaches fruition by the end of the 1920s, um, when the state under Stalin decides to aim for socialism, but in only one country. So remember of National Socialism. These are not the Nazis, obviously, but you can see that National Socialism is sort of, you create a closed loop inside the country that is hyper nationalistic, and that does not uh, is not really seeking some sort of larger global revolution anymore. One thing that Stalin institutes are a series of 5-year plans, meaning a series of 5-year economic plans, um, and to try to fundamentally change the Soviet Union from what had been predominantly an agrarian state to a powerful industrial state, a sort of a sort of attempt to really leapfrog over natural development and sort of institute large scale changes. One of the things that the Soviet state does in terms of trying to make quote unquote more efficient uh, the agricultural sector, which had been dominated by um, um, serfdom in the 19th century, is to create a series of collective farms, sort of these communist farms, in which in which all farmers are supposed to sort of work collectively, as opposed to having sort of um, a sort of free market of farms, or something sort of like a free market of farms in which people are able to sell their goods individually. Now you collectivize agriculture and you create these large state-run institutions. This fundamentally destroys um, the Soviet Union's ability to feed itself, resulting in a terrible famine, which is hidden from the world between 1932 and 1933. Those who resisted collectivism were often jailed or sent to the Gulag, or killed. And it was really a terrible time in the Soviet Union, a phenomena that most of the outside world did not hear that much about. Another thing that Stalin does, and this is a, and I invite you to actually listen to Robert Merriman's lecture on Stalinism, which is excellent. Um, we'll discuss him only briefly here, but Stalin is was really somewhat of a madman, and he was very paranoid about retaining control. Um, he really starts to, one of the characteristics of the totalitarian state is terror, um, and and this was something that Stalin was a master at. Uh, Between 1936 and 1938, suspicious of other other leaders in the Communist Party and in the Soviet military, he undertakes a great purge. He starts to purge elements of the party and of the state and of the military that he felt would in any way oppose him. Um, Much of the time, some of this is paranoiacal fantasies on the part of Stalin as to who wants his job. And this almost ruthless terror campaign he initiates um, results in really what you might call a brain drain of the Soviet state, um, not only politically, but also militarily. Remember, 1936, 1938, you're approaching World War II, um, and the Soviets lose an absolutely unbelievable number of people and soldiers in World War II. And it's a terrible event, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that that Stalin has almost lopped the head off of the Soviet military by the time the war starts. And he's really controlling the military, and he doesn't know how to, he's not a soldier. He doesn't know how to run military. He's just the head of state. But nobody wants to question him. So when he makes several very dire errors at the beginning of the war, there's no one to There's no professional class of military that is there to oppose him. Um, and many of these individuals, both political and military, are sent to the Gulag in Siberia, where many of them perish. Um, Stalin has a very powerful secret police known as the NKVD, um, um, and they are responsible for initiating this reign of terror inside the Soviet Union. Here is an image from right before the Great Famine of 1932 to 1933, where kulaks, so prosperous peasants, so prosperous farmers, are deported. Um, they had resisted collectivization, and they were actually deported and made to work on these collective farms and stripped of their goods. Well, they were prosperous peasants, so because they were prosperous, they had a lot of the land under their cultivation. The attempt by the state to kind of put this top down um, this top down agricultural system on top of what had been a relatively decently functioning agrarian economy um, results in the famine. Um, Here is a aerial shot of the Soviet industrial city of Magnitogorsk in the Ural Mountains. This is one of the things that is a characteristic of Stalin's 5-year plans, the creation of sort of like these humongous industrial cities that workers will live in and work in, and they are almost created out of whole cloth. This is what the state is putting. The Soviets are putting a lot of their energy and money into in the 5-year plans to create this new sort of perfect industrial worker state. Supposedly perfect, I say. Here's a map. This comes from the 1950s, actually, but of Gulag forced labor camps. Remember now that the Gulag, which refers to the system of forced labor camps, which really exists all over the Soviet Union, although it's often associated with Siberia, although it's not the only place where these camps are erected. Um, these forced labor camps um, provide labor to the state. It's this form of like sort of creating a group of outsiders that are put into these camps and then actually work. And so it's really a form of slavery, as is noted on this poster here that's issued in the United States in the 1950s. Well, let's move away from Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and we'll discuss it more in relation to World War II, and then move on and talk about some of the leaders of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. The first person you have to start with when you talk about fascism is Mussolini. Mussolini was the head of the fascist party. I mean, the term fascism comes from the fascist party of Italy. Fascism later comes to become a word that describes a particular form of governance and is used today in that respect, but its origins come from the actual fascist party of Italy. And the origins of the term, as you can see with the figure on the right, actually come from the Roman Empire. The fasces, Fasces, was a bundle of sticks that was tied together with leather thongs, and see here it holds this axe, as sort of a ceremonial and military device, but it was seen to symbolize the sticks that were so close together and tied together that fascists believed their party was as tightly united as those sticks. So that was sort of the symbolic reference to the fasces that the fascists took. Also, the axe, sort of the militaristic um, aspect of the fasces. Fascism in Italy and fascism in general, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about fascism, and then we'll talk about it in relation to how Mussolini defines it, was authoritarian, collective, nationalistic, and expansionist. So not only is it authoritarian inside the state, usually ruled by one party or ruled by often one man, it was collective in that there was not room for individualism there. That all of the elements of the populace needed to be united in their support of the authoritarian state. So it's collective. Anybody who did not would be killed, deported, exiled, jailed, etc. It was hyper nationalistic in that no matter where fascism took hold, whether that be in Japan um, or Germany or Italy, it exalted the power of the state and the pride of the particular, perceived characteristics of the history of that state. So it was very nationalistic at the expense of seeing their nation necessarily as part of the rest of the world. They saw it as really superior to the rest of the world, sort of hyper patriotism. Fascism was also expansionist in that one of the aspects of having a hyper nationalist authoritarian state is that one of the ways to buoy the state's economy as well as to direct the energies of the people towards some sort of achievement was often to expand the borders of that state. This is one of the problems why fascists or different fascist dictatorships actually had somewhat of a difficult time cooperating because they often wanted the same places. So they're kind of both imperial in that they both want to expand. Both want to expand their borders and both perceive that their natural borders are not just those of the present day. That their natural borders must either encompass um, other peoples who speak their language or other peoples who are supposedly um, uh, ethnically part of the state but do not live in the state, and so they're often expansions. And then there's just the idea that these states just want colonies in order to fuel their own growth as well. Fascism was generally anti-communist. Communist in the sense of international communism, a sort of global workers' revolution. This was the dream or the perceived or stated dream of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Fascism is reflexively anti that. It's reflexively anti this global revolution, and and nationalism mitigates against that global revolution, or as you can remember from Stalin's idea of socialism in one country, uh, you did have this, sort of nationalism centered around um, a form of socialism or a form of sort of communism. Um, Fascists um, were very, very against the ideas of communism and the sort of the ideas that there should be one sort of leveled economy. In 19, um, let's talk about, here's Benito Mussolini, and sort of a quote from him, 1932, gives you an idea of the sort of philosophical underpinnings of the fascist state. And now, one thing to remember about fascism is that um, it's often there. It's often hard to come up with a definitive philosophy of fascism because fascism is really just about power. So anything that gets a fascist to power um, will be um, will be lionized. So, but here's some attempt and expression of philosophy. Anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state, which stands for the conscience and the universal will of man as a historic entity. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Fascism is therefore opposed to that form of democracy which equates the nation to the majority, lowering it to the level of the largest number. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right, a fascist century. If the 19th century was a century of the individual, liberalism implies individualism, we are free to believe that this is a collective century, and therefore the century of the state. So you can see that there's this subsuming of the individual into the collective fascist goal and the state itself. There is no individual. Everybody must serve the state and must serve the state faithfully and loyally, without question. Individuals do not matter in this fascist conception of the state. Another thing that fascism does is it often combines the military, the military, the government, and the business world are often completely under one umbrella, and they're synergistic. They work, they all exist under the state, but there's no, for instance, free market in terms of the business. There's no independent military, um, which which can often sometimes be a check on the power of a one-party state. Um, so the military is under the state, the government is under the state, and business is all under the state. It's all under the this this one party. This one party is often ruled by a single individual. In the case of Italy, it's ruled by Benito Mussolini. So a strong single leader rules this entire matrix. And often you'll have a cult of personality that grows up around that single strong leader, an almost sort of a deifying of that leader. A deifying of that leader, in that that leader can do no wrong. That leader is almost superhuman. That leader is perfect in every way. Um, it's often a province of people who have severe personality disorders, is what how it would be diagnosed psychologically, and that they rise to the top and they are so egotistical that they the entire state is a function of them, a function of their will. Sometimes they even purport to be immortal. Um, so this is sort of the same thing, but some of the characteristics of fascism that we'll see specifically under Mussolini and Hitler are rejection of democracy, rejection of mass rule, so rejection of parliamentary democracy. That it's seen as that's not only is it seen as unworkable and slow and messy, um, it's it's seen as a imperfect way of expressing the will of the people. The will of the people, remember, under a fascist state, is expressed through the single strong leader. So, having the idea that people have, voting rights and the ability to choose their leaders, that's everybody chose the assumption or the assumption or the kind of party line, you might say, in a fascist nation is that, oh no, the leader is the expression of the people. The people chose that leader, um, because they acquiesce to his rule. They acquiesce to a certain extent to his terror. Often in fascism, that because it's also hyper nationalistic, it's that the peasantry often sort of uh, uh, the peasantry is seen as the root of the power. So rural um, individuals and the land itself is seen to be the expression of the fascist state. The Volk, meaning the people in German, that is the true Volk. Those who you'll hear this term, blood and soil, often under fascism. That the blood of the peasantry is combined with the soil, and so the blood of the land is the soil, sort of like the soil runs through your veins, or the blood your blood runs through the land, and so it's kind of united. Of course, remember we talked about that under this totalitarian system. This is totalitarian. Fascism is a form of can become a form of totalitarianism, as it does under Hitler, certainly. Um, those whose blood is not part of the soil, those are the outsiders, right? Those it might be their fault for what is occurring in the society. They are to be blamed, right? So the people who are the Volk, how do you define those people? Well, we'll get to that a little bit. Led by a strong, charismatic leader, um, and a lot of um, fascist ideology merges with and is buoyed by social Darwinism. and the idea of the race, quote unquote, that the race, the people who are of the state, the Volk, um, they are superior, they are perfect in many ways. They are not only the inspiration for the state, but they are, as you'll see under Hitler, they are often believed to be sort of a higher form of humanity, a higher evolutionary form of humanity. And so all these old ideas of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, right, um, are tied to um, the belief system of these fascist states. Often, what what happened in the 1920s and 1930s, both in Italy and Germany, is that remember we said fascists were diametrically opposed to communists. Well, when you have on one side fascists and on one side communists, if communists are threatening to, sort of the nationalization of industries, the are threatening to sort of want to have this sort of international workers' revolution, well, that is intensely um, disturbing to capitalists and businessmen, right? Remember, Hitler's actually going to get a ton of his support from small and medium businessmen. Uh, that these, I guess you would call it sort of the bedrock of a lot of traditional conservatism, comes from businessmen, and so uh, these fascist states or these one-party states, the party aligns with um, conservatism because conservatives are wary of communists. And so, in this kind of binary world that develops in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s between fascists and communists, conservatives flock to fascists because they're afraid that their ability to do business is going to be taken away by communists. This bargain doesn't really work out because fascists are going to take over the businesses too. Um, but that's a separate point. And so fascism is seen as a bulwark against communism in this rush to extremes. Um, um, and in almost all characteristics of fascism, economic decline is a spark for the rise of it. One, this is somewhat of an aside, but it's one of the things that when you think of what happens to, for instance, Germany during the 1920s and 1930s, it just almost boggles the mind. Because Germans had, certainly from the unification of Germany in the 1870s, had believed in their own superiority. They believed that theirs was, in many ways, sort of the fullest expression of civilization. A lot of this was tied to looking at individuals like Beethoven. You see here on the right, Beethoven, the sort of his music, the transcendence of his music, the beauty of his music was seen almost as perfect. And Germans were understandably proud of Beethoven. Well, this this came to exhibit in the over the course of the 19th century, this belief in that the Germans were superior. They were superior to, say, the British, and they were superior to the Slavs. They were superior to the Russians. They were superior to the French. And the irony of this um, is that this belief in superiority, this belief in the superiority of the German race, grew into such a corrosive ideology. Some of this was taken from the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, seen here on the left. Nietzsche, in his work Thus Spake Zarathustra, conceived of the Superman, which is not a good translation of Übermensch. Really, kind of the beyond man is really what it's um, supposed to translate to, but often in English it became the Superman, which is actually where the character Superman comes from, but that's a whole other story. Um, that the Übermensch, that Nietzsche conceived that the new century was going to be the century of the individual who becomes almost a new form of humanity. Um, but Nietzsche didn't really mean this in the context of how Hitler would take it, right? Hitler would take it in reference certainly to himself and to his own perceived powers. Uh, but Hitler took sort of Nietzsche's idea of the Superman and created an ideology of it that related to the German, the quote unquote, the German people or the German race. Um, One thing that is just what we can see from this is like, look, you have Germans were also very understandably proud of their industry. They were proud of their uh, their craftsmanship. They were proud of um, their automobiles, for instance, Mercedes Benz. They were very proud of the machinery that they were able to create and the precision that they were able to put into it. Well, um, they're proud of the Autobahn and Volkswagens. Volkswagen comes from People Wagon comes from they come about during Nazi Germany. Um, but what is so terrible about this form of superiority is that if we look at a place like Auschwitz, the concentration camp of Auschwitz, um, there was a saying that some people said that that Auschwitz was kept terribly clean and very precise and very orderly. That you could actually eat off the floor at Auschwitz. That's how clean it was. But it was really a machinery, a precision machinery of death that Germany's created. They created um, a they and Auschwitz can sometimes be seen as just a sort of a giant machine, like a precise machine, almost like these precise German machines that were being created before. And that the terrible, terrible irony of this belief in German superiority is that at the end of this fantasy, what gets created is a precision machine of mass murder. And what was believed to be a sort of marker of German superiority, a sort of hint of it, this 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 sort of efficiency, this craftsmanship, is all put into um, is all put into concentration camps, or at least that's sort of the end result. And it's one of the sort of terrible ironies of this belief. These horrors of precision and efficiency are put towards the murder, attempted genocide of an entire people. One example of this, and can be seen, and this is a book about the subject, but which I find terribly sort of evokes this, is that IBM International Business Machines, at the really this is at the dawn of computerization. IBM actually goes over to Germany with punch cards, and if I don't know if you know about the early history of computing, but early computers would operate on these punch cards. So you'd punch out, these little chads, and then there'd be a machine. You'd run this. These are still around today, and some voting machines, etc. You might encounter them. You put this card through the machine, and then the card reads the holes, and through that, it's able to make these computations as to the data that's put into it. These is an early form of computing. Well, IBM brought this technology over to Germany in 1933, and in 1934, the Germans have a census. On the census are what religion are you, where do you live, and this would become, um, unfortunately, a tool of the Germans. This in the Holocaust, in identifying Jews, identifying people that they considered undesirable, because they would take it off of this 1934 census. So it's chilling, especially since we know that in this online world that we live in today, in this computerized world that we live in today, where there's such a lack of privacy, that all of this information in the service of a totalitarian state could result in terrible consequences. So, but beyond that, in the context of the 1930s, um, how this new technology, really, this new technology, computerization. The Nazis, you know, grab right onto it. Other examples of this sort of precision and know-how, or not know-how, but sort of intense devotion um, to machinery and German superiority being connected to German machines can be found in Werner von Braun, who's really sometimes called the father of the U.S. space program. Um, von Braun was a member of rocketry societies in the 1920s, and they had their belief um, that humanity was destined to colonize the universe and destined to get off the planet through rockets, and that this was often seen as a way of sort of escaping the planet before um, some bigger war after the Great War would occur. Well, von Braun is put to work making the V1 and the V2 rocket for the Germans, which they rained down on London during the Blitz. So it's used as a weapon of war. It's seen as this utopian thing by von Braun in his early years that he's doing, but he goes to work um, making military hardware, making this sort of really a weapon of terror because there's no precision to these rockets at the time. There was no guidance to them. They just basically landed and exploded, um, and it killed hundreds of people in London, thousands of people in London. Well, these were the first rockets. Von Braun, in order to construct these rockets, presided over a concentration camp, Dora, in which thousands died. A small concentration camp, but a concentration camp nonetheless. He was an SS officer under the Nazi state. After the war, his um, his technical know-how is taken by the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army, under something called Operation Paperclip, takes him to the United States, to the deserts of the desert Southwest, and eventually he puts together the rocket team, which creates the Apollo program, creates the American space program, and he also makes several Walt Disney videos, and so you see this move from from uh, that this pride and sometimes often these kind of utopian ideals which are bound up in rocketry and bound up in von Braun from the 1920s and from his early years dreaming of creating rockets, and then by the 1940s he finds himself an SS officer presiding over a concentration camp, creating weapons of war. He would eventually, I guess you'd say, fulfill that dream when he gets to the United States and is able to create actual rockets in the U.S. space program. But um, but it's a sad, dark story in many ways as well. So how does National Socialism come about in Germany? How do the Nazis come to power? They come to power through this man here. I like this picture of him mainly because I believe this is one of the pictures that he wanted destroyed. They were taken of him, and they were not destroyed. And he believed they made him look like a fool. So I proudly present this picture here. Um, who is Adolf Hitler? It's a really good question. It's it's one of those questions which fascinates people even to this day. Um, the most hated and feared man, really, in some ways, of the 20th century, although Stalin um, definitely is in a close competition. Uh, he's born in Austria on April 20th, 1889. He early on he's a struggling artist. He wants to go to art school. Um, and he decides, sort of rootless, he decides he joins the army. Um, and in the army, in World War I, he says in Mein Kampf that he experiences this sort of conversion, this sort of awakening. And this is after being blinded by poison gas. Um, his epiphany is that nothing, nothing, nothing more profound that everything is essentially the Jews' fault. Um, and this is something he puts into Mein Kampf. Um, he Many German soldiers, many sort of what you may call right-wing German military, after the surrender of Germany or after the armistice, were outraged that Germany gave up in World War One. This is despite the fact that you have essentially 12-year-olds on the battlefield who are starving by the end of World War One when the Germans finally sue for peace. The uh, that Hitler and others like him believed that um, they had been stabbed in the back by Marxists, that the civilian leadership of the war during World War One had failed them, had made not only colossal mistakes, which had resulted um, in the stalemate on the Western Front in the first place, but um, also that at the end of the war they could have kept fighting, they could have won if they just kept going, but no, it was Marxists um, and civilian leadership, and specifically Jews, who stabbed the military men in the back right when they could have achieved their greatest victory. All of this was absolute nonsense. German army was was struggling greatly at the end of World War One. Well, Hitler actually gets a job. He gets a job with the new state apparatus to actually spy on a right wing organization. And he goes to, he starts to spy on this organization and then eventually becomes part of it, actually sort of turns and not only then becomes its leader. And these are the early National Socialists. These are the Nazis. Um, and he joins the organization. He becomes really its leader. In 1923, becomes one of its leaders. In 1923, the Nazis decide to try to kidnap some of this civilian leadership of the German government. And remember, this is a very small sort of right wing um, group at this point, and they try to kidnap them in a Munich beer hall. This ends up being a disaster. In fact, um, the police arrive, and 16 Nazis are actually killed in this putsch, which is kind of this attempted takeover of the government by taking over elements of the government in this beer hall. It's wildly unsuccessful, wildly ill-conceived, and as a result, Hitler is thrown in prison with other of his Nazi compatriots, those who were not killed. And in prison, he ends up writing Mein Kampf, one of the most diabolical books ever written, a book which is essentially just one, in many aspects, one long hate speech. Um, the In Mein Kampf, Hitler lays at the feet of the Jews the blame for everything that's gone wrong in Germany, and he has within it this very, very simplistic and very sort of filled with vitriol view of Jews, um, something that really debases them, sees them as subhuman, sees them as not human, sees them as sort of a the cause not only of German privation and German downfall, but advocates their removal from Germany altogether, advocates their complete relocation, and his book becomes very successful. It translates, by the way, to My Struggle, which is one of those. Um, Whenever you hear somebody like this talk about their problems and their struggle, you know that they're kind of just, um, they want you to take pity on them. So Hitler, it's just pathetic. Here are some of the. I mean, it's not just Hitler. Let's get this straight. Hitler had many people behind him who were sort of architects of the Nazi regime and the Nazi Party. Um, it's not the work of one man. What happened in World War II in Europe and what happened in the Holocaust. This is the work of many people, and not just these eight. This is the work of an entire people became sort of subsumed by this madness. Um, I could go through each of these here, but I won't. I mean, just to give you, Hermann Goring was kind of a early early Nazi who um, who was early part of the movement. He was um, he was a member of the German military, was seen as pretty high up in the German military in World War I, and so his support was seen as crucial to galvanizing German military support of the Nazis. Um, you had individuals like Alfred Rosenberg, who was really kind of their minister of propaganda, who would author absolutely disgusting screeds about Jews, some of the worst. Really, in many ways, he becomes the architect of the hate, the the broad-based hatred of Jews, which resulted in the acquiescence of the German people to the Holocaust during World War II. You have Leni Riefenstahl, who creates essentially propaganda films for the Nazi regime, such as Triumph of the Will. Um, um, you have individuals like Albert Speer, who would later go on to write a book about his experiences in the Nazi high command, who is an actual architect who advocates a kind of totally rebuilding of Berlin to be some sort of model city. Um, you have Joseph Mengele, who is the absolutely depraved individual who conducts experiments on live humans in concentration camps, um, experiments on twins. Um, just a really, and there's more. What drives these individuals to um, create a state which has as its heart, by 1942, essentially the attempted extermination of entire people, and what drives Hitler's ideology? Well, for this, we have to go back, and this was a pervasive idea in European and American Western culture in general in the period between, say, 1870 and 1920. And the idea was this. Remember this idea of social Darwinism, this idea that there are certain people who are certain groups of people that are more highly advanced, either technologically than others, or perhaps this this belief is also sort of translated into the belief in sort of genetic superiority of certain groups of people. And eugenics, it was a quote unquote pseudoscience of the this period, which said that you could breed out undesirable characteristics in particular groups of people through selective breeding and the prevention of others from breeding and having children, so that you could, in some way, under eugenics or under a eugenics regime, through eugenics testing, you could actually perfect the race. You could perfect humanity that way. Um, this idea extended to a variety of different things. One, for instance, criminals. There was a vast eugenics literature about criminals and how criminals were genetically inferior in some ways and what was the matter with them. Maybe if you could prevent criminals from breeding, or maybe you could find out what is genetically wrong with criminals. That crime of any sort was seen as some sort of expression of a genetic abnormality or something inside, scientifically inside the human beings. This is this, of course, remember, crime is what the state says crime is, right? So if a state believes that crime is talking against the state, then then you are seen as genetically inferior by the state. So you see how this kind of circular logic works. I mean, crimes differ from culture to culture. Not every, you know, um, um, like for instance, let's the definition of murder. What is murder? Murder is the killing of another person. But what does a soldier do on the battlefield? Right? Isn't that the same thing? No, because it's state sanctioned killing, right? So crime is a slippery concept, and this is one of the things that eugenicists or eugenics was looking at was the sort of biological nature of criminality, which is problematic to say the least. Disability, human disability. So to try to breed out those characteristics that create disabilities. So sort of certainly inherited diseases, for instance. That would be the most obvious manifestation of that. But disability didn't only extend to that. Disability also went to, remember, it goes to perceived disability. So it's not just um, weeding out sort of disabilities, genetic disabilities, but also those who are sort of disabled in one way or another, um, or start to be seen as less desirable in the state. So criminals are seen as less desirable. The disabled are seen as less desirable. So inside the state, um, those individuals are seen as in some way, in Hitlerian language, sort of polluting the race, right? That is the diabolical way that this is thought of. That the disabled are in some way bringing the race down. So, not only to breed out those characteristics in future generations, and not only to prevent them through preventing the disabled from, or those who are perceived as disabled from, breeding, but the notion of disability also extends to those who are seen as genetically inferior racially, and this will start to extend to Jews. Right? So, um, and the question of who is fit is the central question of eugenics. How do you determine who is fit to survive, who is fit? And this becomes a judgment of the state. Um, Forced sterilization is one way in which the state mandates, and forced sterilization occurred in almost every nation in one way, shape, or form. Occurred in the United States, um, and uh, and forced sterilization was a way of seeing to sort of prevent future quote unquote disabled individuals from having more children. But that road from forced sterilization, so the preventing of future generations from existing and inheriting the supposedly inferior characteristics of the current generation, is extended again not only to the disabled, but extended to races that are seen as quote unquote races that are seen as inferior. Um, and then that road leads to extermination, because not only is the state now looking towards, and the Nazi state looking, well, how the Nazi state will do it, look towards preventing that future generation from being born, but is also looking to kill and murder an entire people. I'm going to get to the Nuremberg laws in a second. I'm going to show you a chart. On the right is Sir Francis Galton, who was a British eugenicist who who's perhaps most mm, per, perhaps most known for his idea of sort of transplanting the British colonists down to Africa, and his idea was that Africans were inferior, and that the African continent should be replaced with white Britons, and so this is also a eugenics kind of racial replacement argument. In any case, in 1935, the Nazi regime institutes the Nuremberg laws. Um, Here's a chart of the Nuremberg laws, which is obviously in German, but as you can see over here, you see this, it says Jew in or Jewish in German, and these Nuremberg laws were meant to determine, or were meant to classify who would be considered a Jew under um, the Nazi regime, and this was because Jews were stripped of their citizenship, and they were basically disallowed from many walks of life as the Nazis took power after 1933. So, under the Nuremberg laws, this was a way of determining the genetic nature of who was Jewish and who was, Aryan, which is the idea of the Aryan race from the Germans. So from Hitlerian sort of Nazi socialist ideology. Um, so basically, what is also terribly disturbing about the Nuremberg laws and their racial classifications was that the Nazis actually looked to uh, laws that determined who was black in the American South under in the Jim Crow era, laws that arise in the South to maintain segregation and define who is black and who is white. The Nazis essentially take those laws, this patchwork of Jim Crow laws, which existed across the Deep South, take them and just really repurpose these ideas into charts to determine who is Jewish. Um, this is a inheritance from American or Southern American racial practice that is not often taught because it's and it's it should be taught more. Um, so this is one of the charts that the Nazis come up with to determine who is Jewish. Essentially, if you had one, if you were, I think, 1/8, if you had a great grandmother or a great grandparent who was Jewish, you were Jewish. But I don't know the exact formula. Um, and then this is a sign, sort of saying this is a Jewish shop. Do not shop here. So the Nazis start to terrorize um, Jews all over Germany in the 1930s after they come to power. So how do the Nazis take over Germany? How does this occur? Um, well, Hitler, if you look at pictures of him, does not seem like a very impressive person. He's small. He doesn't look Aryan, right? Because he's got dark hair. I mean, the Aryan race, the sort of supposed dream of the Aryan race was blonde hair, blue eyes. So he doesn't even. Hitler did have piercing blue eyes, which many people did remark on. That were somewhat hypnotic. He was a hypnotic speaker. Also, he had studied ways of persuasively convincing a populace of things through hand motions and through the use of certain words and the repetition of certain words. Got it a little bit down to his own form of dark science. Well, in 1933, and so he's rising in popularity. His book is popular. In 1933, the Nazis, and remember, in 1932, if you remember that chart before of economic downturn, Germany's in free fall at this point. I mean, essentially their economic indicators have basically been halved between 1930 and 1932. Well, 1933, the Nazis are becoming more popular. There's these running street battles between Nazis and communists. The Nazis actually received 34% of the vote. There's actually a vote, an election. 34% of the German people vote for the Nazis. Now, that's not 50%, but it's one third. And in an arrangement, because the way that the government worked was that doesn't mean that you would be that the leader of that party would become sort of just full head of Germany. Hitler is appointed chancellor. Well, later that year, the Reichstag fire occurs. Let's see if I can play this. So the German Parliament building, the Reichstag, is essentially destroyed one night, um, and Hitler blames the communists for the fire. It's not really even clear today who started the fire. many suspected that Hitler started it himself, which is why the term Reichstag fire has come to serve as a something where a government actually creates a problem, then in order to solve it, and by solving it, they consolidate their power. And Hitler declares a state of emergency and essentially um, eliminates all other political parties. So 1933, 34% of the vote. Later that year, Hitler essentially becomes the only leader of Germany, eliminates all opposition, and declares a state of emergency, which never stops. Hitler forms the SS and the Gestapo. The Gestapo is becomes the force that goes to enforce these racial laws and enforce and starts to round up Jews. Eventually, will be they will kill many Jews, but they're also kind of the secret police to root this out. The SS is kind of like the elite um, internal Nazi army force. They will be almost above the army, but they are loyal to Hitler. We talked about the census. 1934, Hitler becomes Führer, and you see where we have with totalitarianism. The army pledges allegiance to Hitler personally. They don't pledge allegiance to the German state. They don't pledge allegiance to the German people. They pledge allegiance to Hitler personally. We don't have that form of government. The president is commander in chief of the armed forces, but the armed forces do not worship the president of the United States. They do not pledge allegiance to the president of the United States. They pledge allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. This is in Germany under Hitler. This was not the case. The army pledges allegiance to the person, Hitler personally. What do the Nazis do? And the road to this is sometimes best told in, in documentaries about the subject, but I'm going to go through a number of terms to give you a sense of what the Nazis do. One of Hitler's major concepts that he endorses is called Lebensraum, which means literally living room, Lebensraum. That what the Germans desired was more space in Europe for the German people to flourish and live. That meant expanding the borders of Germany, expanding them into Poland, expanding them into Czechoslovakia, expanding them into Austria. Um, um, and this idea of Lebensraum, um, the idea was that Hitler believed that the German people could not flourish in the borders that were there, that they had to annex other German-speaking peoples and bring those other German-speaking peoples who might live in other countries into the larger German, the greater perceived German state. And so Lebensraum was the idea that Germany needs to spread and take over more areas. Hitler immediately embarked on basically violated many of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which said that Germany could not militarize. There were these checks on how many armaments Germany could have. Hitler just completely ignores this. Essentially, completely ignores this. Knows that there's no way for them to enforce it, and just blows through all of these supposed rules under the treaty, and starts to rapidly build up the German military, which is being greeted with huge alarm in almost every other European nation. Hitler embarks also on a plan of enforcing racial purity, so preventing intermarriage between Jews and Gypsies, preventing intermarriage between Jews and Aryans, and also preventing intermarriage of Aryans and Gypsies, etc. So basically, trying to purify the German race into this sort of Aryan race that Hitler believed, or stated that he wanted to create. In 1933, the first concentration camps open, and this is an important timeline to understand. When we talk about concentration camps, just look at the word concentration. The only thing a concentration camp is a place where people are concentrated. Okay, so the first concentration camps are not extermination camps. They are places where Jews and other people, really at first it's actually political prisoners who are put into these concentration camps because they are to be concentrated. They are to be kept in one place. They are kept out of the place where they originally are from. Right? They are kept away from the populace. They are maybe made to work. It's a prison camp, but it's also a concentration camp. So it's a place to concentrate those elements of society that you want away from you. That doesn't mean that they necessarily committed a crime, right? They committed a thought crime in terms of political prisoners, right? So they are to be concentrated somewhere else. That's how the camps start. Okay, so any sort of camp in which peoples are concentrated, in which peoples are moved or held um, in a sort of limbo, because it's not clear what's going to happen to those individuals. Will they be released? No. Well, if you're creating some of these camps to enforce racial purity or sort of political purity, what happens to those people? And the longer that they stay in there, the closer a concentration camp edges towards an extermination camp. And this is what happens in World War II, because the concentration camps really won't be turned into extermination camps until you get to, say, 1942. People, don't get me wrong, people are dying and people are getting killed in concentration camps, but the concentration camp morphing into essentially a murder machine doesn't occur until the war is underway in 1942. 1933, Jews are barred from public employment, so they can't hold any positions in the government. So they're really they're forced to being totally second-class citizens. They lose their citizenship in 1933. They're actually stripped of their citizenship. So Jews that had lived in Germany their families had lived in Germany for, in some cases, over 1,000 years. Um, they're stripped of their citizenship. They are no longer citizens of the German state. They're outsiders. So laws don't apply to them anymore, citizenship laws. They prevented intermarriage. 1938, in Paris, the story starts in Paris. In Paris, a communist assassinates a Nazi high official in Paris, um, and and that triggers a sort of state-sponsored terrorist campaign inside Germany, in which the Nazis, um, sort of Nazi thugs, the SS, etc., go and basically break the windows and harass and arrest um, Jews all over Germany, burn down hundreds of synagogues. One of them you can see burning in your lower right. Burn down synagogues, destroy Jewish businesses. It's called Kristallnacht because that means crystal night, um, night of the broken glass. Um, it's a terrible um, event for Jews in Germany because it's really it, it it's just so widespread. It's taking place almost all across Germany, in which Jews, especially in urban contexts, are being targeted for just being Jewish. Um, and it's really the sort of breaking point by which not only do many Jews realize that they have to get out of Germany as fast as possible, that's just not possible for most of them, emigration, but also that this is really the German state is becoming less and less tolerant. They weren't. I mean, it's becoming it's cracking down more and more on just being Jewish. 1938, same year, Germany will basically annex Austria. So Germany and Austria now become part of this larger, greater Germany. Austria, which had been a separate state, now is wholly part of the greater German state under something called Anschluss. Here's Anschluss. Um, here, Austria is called Ostmark, or the Eastern realm, basically. And so here, see, all of this was Austria. Now look, now here is Czechoslovakia, which Hitler will call a dagger pointing at the heart of Germany in his usual bombastic, idiotic speech. One thing, so after Anschluss, see this portion of Czechoslovakia, this western portion, which Germany calls the Sudetenland or the Southern Land, right? Because that's the thinking about it in terms of in German terms. Um, Hitler wants to annex this Sudetenland, as he calls it. There are many German speakers in this part of the Czech Republic, in this part of the West, but that doesn't necessarily mean they want to be part of Germany. They're just German speakers. But this is Hitler wants to put all of these German speakers under this whole idea of Greater Germany to make Germany stronger. So you see this principle. Um, whoops, hold on. So here we end. Well, we'll get back to Hitler in a second, but this is this shows German aggressions up until 1939. So in 1938, Hitler will annex the Sudetenland and move tanks into there, and the story of that. Actually, let's just go to that. This happens at something called the Munich Conference in 1938. In the Munich Conference, the leaders of the major leaders of Europe all gather. Hitler, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Benito Mussolini, Daladier of France, and they unite. And Hitler assures the gathered leaders, as long as you allow me to annex the Sudetenland, to annex this portion of Western Czechoslovakia of the Czech Republic, what is today the Czech Republic, excuse me. Today, Czechoslovakia is two states, Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. Hitler says that if you allow the to take that over, that he has no other territorial ambitions. Then he will be done. That's what he says. Now Great Britain doesn't really have any. They don't want to go to war. Chamberlain doesn't want to go to war. He comes back and he waves this piece of paper saying he has achieved peace in our time, and that peace in our time is basically allowing Hitler to take over the Sudetenland with the assurance on paper that he won't do anything else. Hitler must have been laughing his way all the way back from the conference, because obviously what will happen next year, the following year, in 1939, is really the beginning of the war. Because he annexes the Sudetenland, and then in 1939, in a secret pact, he signs a non-aggression pact with the USSR in 1939. So he signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. So obviously, what is obvious from this is in between Germany and the Soviet Union is Poland. This is what Germany wants to move into. But remember, Hitler had made this assurance to Neville Chamberlain, oh no, I'm all done. Well, anyway, so they have this non-aggression pact. Now remember, Soviet Union, Stalin, communist, Nazi. I mean, it's supposed to be like oil and water. Well, Stalin agrees to this for his own purposes, thinking that this will buy him some time if he allows Hitler to take over sort of some of Poland. But they engage in this non-aggression pact. Well, both Hitler and Stalin are not military commanders. They don't really know what they're doing, and we'll see what you'll see what happens in the course of World War II. Germany then makes another demand. Says, "Oh, wait, no. Remember, I said peace in our. I've said I wouldn't have any more territorial ambitions." Now he demands what he calls East Prussia. So these names, East Prussia, meaning he's demanding Poland. France and Britain basically tell him, "Look, if you take over Poland, we are going to go to war. That there's no other. That's just we're going to get involved." Now remember also, if we go back to World War One, remember World War One, remember what happened. Remember the Schlieffen Plan. Germany attacks France, comes back, and then has their and then is able to take over Paris. So that's the plan, and then moves many of its troops to the Eastern Front to prevent an attack from the Soviet Union. This is the way that Germany saw itself as perhaps expanding during World War One. This was one of the ideas under the Schlieffen Plan before World War One, that how Germany would fight this European war. Well, look what happens. France and UK deliver an ultimatum because France knows that if Germany is allowed to take over um, Poland, you know, what is it? The power of Germany will increase exponentially. Poland certainly does not want to be taken over. Well, September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. September 3rd, 1939, UK and the France both declare war on Germany. Um, and Hitler, the next year, attacks France, invades their way all to Paris, invades Poland in 1939, and essentially takes over all of Poland in a matter of weeks. Why is Hitler so successful? Well, the form of warfare that the Germans are using is called Blitzkrieg, which employs tanks and FM radios that sort of communicate with each other in this very new and revolutionary way. These very light tanks, and so the Germans essentially have developed this military that is super fast, and is able to, and they call it the lightning war, Blitzkrieg. So they have a Luftwaffe, which is the most advanced air force in the world, and they strike with lightning speed and take over Poland, and the next year they take over France. And then we are in the midst of World War II. And we will talk more about that in a subsequent lesson.